Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the musings about software breakthroughs with Alex and our special guest, Carson. Uh, we're still in the pandemic, unfortunately. Can't travel, so we are using remote, which works fine. And today I'm really excited to welcome Carson because I got very intrigued by his work, which I think is very significant. And we'll chat. We'll spend hopefully 1 hour elaborating on that. I'm super excited. And this series of video casts, podcasts, focused on what I would like to do to call breakthroughs in software profession, because we've been going in circles a lot and seeing very few breakthroughs. We've just been polishing the turd and, rearranging the deck chairs on Titanic, but nothing major is coming out of it. Meanwhile, we're seeing, and I keep talking about it, we're seeing phenomenal breakthroughs in hardware technology, in all the other areas of engineering. Software seems to be stale and stuck in the same old, same old. And today, in particular, my pet peeve is the front end and this endless proliferation of frameworks and one on top of each other, and it's just becoming madness. And then even the most fierce advocates of single page applications and fat clients are throwing the towel in, saying, look, I just can't keep up. It seems to be just going spiraling out of control. Every week we see better and better and promising and this and that, and it threatens to collapse under its own weight. Carson, and always simplicity is always the way out. And I believe what Carson did here, and I don't know if you did it single-handedly or you have a team, you'll explain to us, but I think you made a significant incision and cut through and say, okay, let's go back to simplicity of the web. It's a phenomenal platform that was launched 30 years ago and transformed the world. But why are we deviating from it? Why are we going back to the clunky, desktop, fat client, blah, blah, blah? Over to you, Carson. Please tell us how you got to that and what is the advantage of your approach.
Sure. So for the listeners who aren't familiar with HTMX, HTMX is the primary thing that we're going to talk about today, I assume. And HTMX is a library, a JavaScript library. But before you freak out, it's designed so that you can add things like AJAX interactions to your web page just purely with attributes in HTML. And those attributes are designed to be with the grain of normal web programming. So we're all already familiar with anchor tags and forms. I hope most people watching this should be familiar with those. And the idea with HTMX is to take that concept that was the original HTML hypermedia, functionality available in HTML, and broaden what, basically open that up to more elements and to more complex interactions. And so one way that I like to think about it, now that this took a while for me to really understand about HTMX, but we're trying to generalize HTML as a hypertext, which sounds kind of fancy pants, but all it means is let's take this original idea of the web, of a hypermedia. You click on links or you submit forms, and let's make it more broadly available in the DOM for other elements. So why should only anchors and forms be able to submit requests? Others, in most JavaScript-based applications today, there's all sorts of things driving web requests. And why should only clicks and submit events, which are the traditional events in HTML, be able to trigger those things? And then finally, why, when you make a web request, should you have to replace the entire screen? A lot of the reason why JavaScript got traction early on was because you could replace stuff within a screen and not get that, unfortunately, sometimes very clunky interaction where click on a link and a whole page reloads. It takes, it's a fairly visually dramatic situation. Browsers have gotten better at it. But let's eliminate those restrictions on HTML as a hypertext and just make it so that you can, pepper in some attributes and drive network interactions in that original model. So those interactions are still exchanging HTML with the server. There's no JSON or anything like that. So we're staying within the original model of the web, the hypermedia model of the web. And let's do that, and let's see how far we can get from UX perspective, because I don't think the argument for single page applications certainly is not that they are simpler. I think it's that they are a better user experience. You can do more interesting stuff from a UX standpoint. And so we'll maybe talk about some examples in HTMX, but the theory here is that the reason why HTML fell down to an extent when compared with the JavaScript applications was because it wasn't expressive enough as a hypermedia. A hypermedium, I think I'm supposed to say, but no one says that. So, and so we want to increase the expressivity and just see how far we can get within that original and simpler model. So that was the big idea. It's been a long time that I've been working on it. I originally worked on a library called intercooler.js, and that started off just as a jQuery plugin that I developed for a startup I was working on. And the history of it was that I was actually working on a table. I had a table in an app, and I was trying to use JavaScript. This was back, way back in the day before any of the current stuff it was 2012, I think. And so none of the current JavaScript frameworks were really around. And I was trying to do a dynamic table, and there weren't any really good dynamic table libraries. So I was doing it all myself in raw JavaScript, and it was really slow in the browsers of the day. And I stumbled on the fact that what I could do instead of doing a bunch of stuff on the client side was just ask the server for a big table and slam that into the DOM. And that turned out to be much faster. And it was certainly a lot simpler. And so from there, I kind of grew that into intercooler.js. And intercooler.js was a jQuery. It was very jQuery centric. It came out of that world that I was in jQuery for a long time. And so it had a strong jQuery flavor to it. And about a year ago, when the pandemic actually started, in order to keep from going insane, I said, all right, well, let's go back and revisit that jQuery dependency and see if we can pull it out. And when I did that, I saw that I could. It was pretty easy. JavaScript has come a long way since a decade ago. So I decided to create HTMX, sort of its intercooler 2.0. And we can talk about why I renamed it if you'd like at some point, but that's up to you. So that's the general idea. And that's where I was coming from. I was maybe coming from a more old school web app developer perspective. I'd done thick client work when I was younger, back in the 90s. I did some thick client work, and I didn't like, the reactive aspect of things was new and interesting, but I didn't like thick clients a whole bunch. I mean, there's good and bad with it, but it really struck me as being not very web-like. And so I wanted something that went with the grain of the web instead of shoehorning what I consider an older thick client model on top of this new and relative, I have to say pretty revolutionary method for delivering software.
So a few things. First, I want to say, to me, HTMX is a killer name.
Yeah,
I think
it's a much better name.
Yeah, I think you just kind of hit the jackpot with that name. I don't think you can come up with a better name. It's just like, the moment I saw it, I'm like, what? Some bells rang in my head, like, oh, Max, what is this, right?
Yeah.
But that's perfect. But even better than that is this. We can talk a little bit about different philosophies and whatnot, but in my mind, I'm big on single source of truth, and I'm seeing a lot of duplication of business policy rules that tend to disperse, because you cannot just shove all your, there are some policy rules that live in a thick client and that govern how you interact with the user. But in my experience, it's very hard to make that a single source of truth, because this is not the entirety of your processing. There's got to be some backend processes that also would require the exact same policy rules to be automated. And now you're getting two versions. And before you know it, these versions deviate, and now you have a bug. And that's one of the main reasons why I'm not a big fan of fat clients, because I'm seeing a lot of duplication of logic. And as you know, this is breeding ground for bugs, right?
Yeah.
And so,
additionally, you have to be really careful because the client side is not, and particularly in the browser, is not a trusted computing environment.
No.
So you can't trust what comes from the browser. You always have to revalidate what data is coming in. And you know, when you start looking at things like GraphQL, you're increasing the expressivity of your HTTP endpoints for your front end developers, but you're also giving that power to potentially hostile users. And that's something that I've tried to stress in online discussions, and I've met with mixed success, I think, just in trying to get out this idea. Like, look, guys, when you give a developer SQL access on the back end, that's a categorically different thing than giving that to someone on the front end. Because if you give it to someone on the front end, they can, you know, a hostile user, particularly in a browser where they can just fire up a console, can very quickly exploit whatever powers you're giving to your front end developer. And so in addition to your point, and I think people have tried to address that by running JavaScript on the front end and the back end, where, you know, rules start to diverge from one another. There's also a very strong argument for security, because the server side is a trusted computing environment where you can, to a first order approximation in any event, give your developers full access to the backing data store. Whereas on the front end, that just is not the case. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. I mentioned this on Twitter, and someone said that the way Facebook does it is they generate a whitelist of GraphQL queries that are allowed at build time. And then that is validated somehow. I don't know. It's just like, guys, it's just a bad idea. You know, it's just a bad idea, which is fine. Like, we've had bad ideas before, but certainly a smaller shop is unlikely to do that level of build work.
That kind of, to me, sounds like you painted yourself in a corner and now you're scrambling and you're creating white lists and stuff like that. No, it's bad engineering. So yeah, that's a valid point. But even, and we'll get back to that, but even if we, let's say a browser is a super duper secure environment, and which it isn't, which is the opposite. But even then, I would argue it's not a good idea to load your front end with a lot of business policy rules.
Absolutely.
And now when we go back to how insecure it is, you should be alarmed.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I'm surprised at how little people because people freak out about security, but they freak out about stuff like cross-site scripting and things that are actually pretty hard to pull off. but then they'll slap a GraphQL API, and I'm like, what are you doing? But
yeah,
you know,
I can tell you, Carson, I think this is going to be the year, maybe not, but maybe this year, next year, where we are moving from DevOps to DevSecOps. And it's kind of in the organization where I work, this is now top of the list, DevSecOps.
Okay.
Because we got really sick and tired of amateurish sort of like faux pas. Like, really? This is what you put in production? Are you kidding? Yep. And security is freaking out. And the security engineers work around the clock, and these guys are spread out thin. And they come to me, can we do something to elevate the bar, because this is killing us. So even when you go out and you preach and you explain, people are pushing back because it's a new territory. I feel it's still a brand new half-baked situation where I think we need to mature, and then the day must come when anybody developing anything, first thing you do is like, did they get security clearance? Okay, then now I can move on. But the last thing on the list, like we do everything, and then let me check if I'm vulnerable, and it's a good approach, right?
Yeah, I agree. We went through this with traditional web apps, right? It used to be people would just concatenate strings together for queries, and then we matured on the server side into a world where, okay, we know how to do this now. We have good OR tools and escaping rules, and it's, so we solved all those problems. but we're making the same mistakes on the front end. Or we're making many of the same mistakes, it appears to me. And also on top of that, it's so complicated. One of the things, simplicity is the prerequisite for reliability, and reliability goes along with security. And so, the more complicated these front ends get, the harder it is to even understand what the security implications are. So, that's another, I think, philosophical argument for this older, simpler approach to software development, where you can see what's going on. It's a web request. You're not doing anything too crazy, and that's it.
Yeah, and also because, as you mentioned, hostile users are always one step ahead of us.
Sure.
They will find things to exploit that we will realize, oh, they're exploiting this. Now we need to be really fast in responding. But if you're a behemoth, and to try and fix that, you remain vulnerable for this extended period of time.
Yeah.
Keep things simpler, then okay, we found another, loophole that they discovered. Bam, bam, bam. Okay, you can fix it in a couple of minutes, and you're good.
Yeah.
So that's another.
Yeah, I think also another thing that's been lost is now the world's really split into front end and back end, and a lot of security issues straddle both. And so I consider myself a full stack developer. I'm not an expert at CSS or any of the tweaks and so on and so forth, but your average, the full stack developer was a very valuable resource, not only for security reasons, but also for optimizations, right? There are optimizations. I just ran into one the other day with HTMX where we have a very slow query for some secondary data on a page. And that data isn't crucial if it doesn't show up right away. And for very large accounts, it might take, 5-10 seconds. Well, we had a request that, the problem is that you couldn't get to the main page until that data had loaded because it was in the normal web request. And there's a very simple pattern called lazy loading with HTMX where you can take a div and basically say on load, go and get your data from this URL. And it'll do that. And you can show a spinner in it or whatever. And just being able to put that in and create the endpoint to load just that partial little bit of HTML allowed me with 3 or 4 attributes and a couple lines of code to solve a performance issue in a manner that would have been very difficult if I was just purely a backend developer or purely a front end developer. Yeah. So that the ability to both optimize and also implement security fixes sort of across the whole stack is another. Some people don't, it's hard to explain it maybe to managers, but it's really valuable to be a full stack developer. And there's no reason we can't get back there and still have pretty good UIs.
Absolutely agree. But you see, with the Byzantine, or how shall I say, the bloat of the current, it's literally humanly impossible to be both front end and back end, because the weight of your front end requires your attention pretty much 7 days a week. And going back to simplicity, now you reopen this capability of, I can straddle both worlds because it's not, I'm not carrying heavy load on the front end. It's HTML, JavaScript. I can roll with that. CSS, or let's leave that to. I agree with you. I'm not going to go crazy about my CSS chops because that can take. But that's cosmetics, right? But
and that's a good and productive split, right? Being able to split on the styling versus the logic, but the splitting on the front end logic and the back end logic, in my opinion, sacrifices quite a bit.
No, not good. Actually, I saw that demo on Twitter that you posted with lazy loading. And it just beautifully illustrates. Okay, so one thing, I want to ask you a few things. One is when I found recently, I stumbled upon HTMX, right? I got excited because I have so many things to do. I was looking for a tutorial rather than me trying to hack something together. I'm like, let me see if there's a tutorial. And I found one. And I started following, and then I was so disappointed because in the tutorial, they were using, I think they were using Ruby on Rails or something. And they were using Rails templates for the front end. I'm like, why? Why are you using ERB? I was so disappointed. So my question to you is, and I know I should be doing my own research, but since we are on the call,
Yeah, sure.
can we do we need to use those, for example, ERB or whatever Django templates on the front end, or can everything be done in HTMX? I don't see why not.
Well, HTMX is attributes on top of HTML. So you're going to have some sort of HTML infrastructure on the back end. You could, however, there's a lot of good libraries that don't rely on templating and that use some sort of builder syntax, depending on the language in question. So I think that there are solutions for what you're kind of chafing at, and which is why not just integrate hypermedia more tightly into the server side. I think for HTMX in any event, one goal of mine has been to be very backend agnostic. So I don't care how you're producing your HTML. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. And people are very passionate about all of them. There's also a lot of server-side frameworks, just languages. And, some people like Django, some people like Rails, some people like, what's the other Ruby one or Python one? Flask. Fetch, but there's there people like Go. Go has a very simple web infrastructure, and so one of the goals with HTMX has been to be agnostic towards the back end.
That's cool. But ideally, in my mind, and maybe I'm idealizing things, but I'd like to have like a backend API, and then on the front end, I just like to have HTMX, AJAX, hitting APIs and getting the data.
Yeah.
The tutorial I was trying to go through was using Ruby code on the front end, which I didn't like.
Okay. That's weird.
That's my pet peeve. Why use Ruby code if you have HTMX? Yeah. So mixing Ruby and HTMX, I was like, well, what's the point? It's kind of.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah, I think, we do need better docs and better tutorials. It is one unfortunate aspect of remaining front-end agnostic back-end agnostic, I should say, is that you kind of need a tutorial per backend because each backend does it a little differently. And so, I'm just one guy. I've got the Discord is pretty active. And so there's a lot of people with a lot of experience in different with different backends, but it is unfortunately one area where I think we need to do a little bit better. And I anticipate over the next year, like we've made a huge amount of headway in the Django world in the last 2 or 3 months. And so Django people are very excited about HTMX, which is great because the docs will get better there. Rails kind of has its own world and its own community, so it's hard to see. There are some Java people. What's your primary back-end technology that you use in your work? What's that?
C#.
C#. Okay. So, and there have been some people that have done some work in C# in it as well. And I think that's one hope I have with HTMX is that it reopens the back end a little bit and opens things up where people can pick different back end technologies and they don't have to commit. For particularly about 2 years ago, there was a huge amount of pressure to adopt Node and JavaScript on the server side because you were writing so much JavaScript on the front end that why have 2 different languages? And, I'm not a big fan of JavaScript, even though I've written quite a bit of JavaScript in the last couple of years. And I would certainly prefer to write my backend. I grew up, programming in Java and Ruby for the most part. And if I was doing a web app, I'd like to probably use those languages to do that. Or C#'s great too. I'm a big fan of Anders Heidelberg. It just really bugged me that there was so much pressure to adopt JavaScript when it's such a, in my mind, it's just not a great programming language. I've come to what's that?
Flimsy. It's a bit flimsy.
It is what it is. I've figured out a way I can write JavaScript and test it and it can be somewhat reliable, but I'm just not a huge fan of it. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the goals. But in order to achieve that goal, we have to remain backend agnostic. We can't put demands on the backend, and so that makes it harder to provide good tutorials for everyone. for all their particular
Here's the
setups.
question. Here's the question, Carson.
Hmm.
In my mind, it's given that it should be backend agnostic because all we are talking about is API endpoints and JSON payload, and it shouldn't matter how that JSON payload got generated on the backend.
Right.
But from the client side, you're sending your request to the URL, and you're getting response. And
Yep.
in excuse me, for example, in Rails, now that response is being massaged with Ruby code embedded in a template. I was hoping same thing can be done with HTMX, right?
Yeah.
So you don't need any other language in your HTML document,
right?
To arrange that data and enable interactivity with the end user in the browser.
Yeah.
Is that a possibility so that you don't care what the backend is built in?
Yeah. So the HTMX expects HTML back from the server. So the server has to produce HTML somehow.
Yeah, but you can.
And the question is how do you produce that? And it sounds to me like you might be interested in some of the more pure templating languages that are HTML, that are very close to HTML, and that offer abstractions like iteration and if statements like directly in the HTML. And they were very popular early on in web development, and I've forgotten the names of any. I'd have to go out and look around, but I think those are available. And certainly, it's a much cleaner hypermedia infrastructure if you go that direction. Yeah. So I think the technologies are there. HTMX is sort of the same way, where there was I feel like with HTMX and intercooler, but particularly with HTMX and just my experience building, there was all this stuff laying on the floor that people were ignoring around web development. And they just weren't, they didn't take the original model of the web very seriously. And in fairness to them, part of that was because the discussion around RESTful software, the REST networking model, had been somewhat hijacked and turned into this discussion around JSON APIs, where, in my opinion, the term REST does not really apply very well because JSON is not naturally a hypermedia in the way that HTML is. And so
the problem with JSON is it's not extensible.
Yeah.
That's the biggest problem.
Yeah. Well, and, this is, if you will humor me for a minute, this is a little bit more of a philosophical. I try not to get too philosophical on some other podcasts.
Please go philosophical. I like that.
Yeah, but with the web, the big difference with the web versus older thick clients was that when you got content down from the server, the client in the browser, being the client here, doesn't know anything about that data. It doesn't know about endpoints. It doesn't know about anything. And it's getting back a hypermedia representation of what the data is and also what you can do with that data. So there are links, there are forms, whatever, right? And the browser doesn't know. It may represent a contact. It might represent an automobile. It might represent whatever. But the browser doesn't know anything about contacts or automobiles or anything else. It just knows this is a hypermedia and I can render it to the user. And then the user, the person, can decide what actions to take. So there's sort of a symmetry with object-oriented programming to an extent, in that an HTML page, when it comes down to you, contains the data for that page as well as the operations that are available on that page. And that original model was very unique and very interesting and very flexible, and it survived network outages and all sorts of crazy stuff, and that's why it took off so much. Well, when you move to JSON, you're moving to a dumb data API, and you can take that dumb data API. JSON is just a serialization format. You can take that and you can do things like embed links in it and so forth, but that never really took off. That never really mattered that much. People eventually just stopped doing it, and the reason they were trying to do it was they were trying to shoehorn this JSON data API into the original REST model of the web. But there was no reason to do that. So I often tell people when they go to JSON, just forget about REST. Don't try and have RESTful stuff. Just do it the other way. Use, GraphQL or whatever you need to get it done to make that a decent data API.
I find that most software engineers are very familiar and what's the word? Attracted to RPC.
Yeah, exactly. It's an art
call, and that is a familiar world, and everybody feels great about it. And JSON is exactly like remote procedure call.
Yep.
And
exactly.
They can let it rip, and it really is ripping, right? But that's not web. That's client server.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's okay. But let's not. It's a misnomer to call it REST because it's not REST.
I think it was exactly. I think it was cargo culty, and it's kind of an interesting story because it started off like you just had the web, and that was REST, right? According to Roy Fielding, that's REST. And then we went to kind of this weird intermediate step of XML APIs. I don't know if you remember that time period. It was like 5-10 years. Not 10. It was like 5 years where we were using XML, and it was a little plausible because it was still kind of a markup language, and maybe there's some. But
we were using. I remember we were using HTTP to tunnel.
Yeah.
To smuggle the payload.
Right.
It was still RPC, right? So
yeah, it was, but it was at least plausible. But then once we went to JSON, it's like, guys, this has nothing to do with this is RPC, just like you said. Most people don't even know what the word, what RPC means these days.
When I talk to people and they, here's my analogy, and tell me if you agree or not. To me, HADEOS, how do you pronounce HADEOS, right?
HADEOS is how I pronounce it, but I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly.
Which to me is REST. If you say REST, I'm thinking HADEOS. HADEOS would be equivalent to somebody saying, hey, do you know a good Indian restaurant? And they give you this. And you go there and you say, can you please give me a menu? And I'll choose what I'm going to order. GraphQL is, somebody goes into a restaurant and says, can you show me where the kitchen is? And they let them in, and they prepare whatever. I mean, it doesn't have to be even food. They can prepare sushi. They just need raw ingredients to cook whatever. And it's a huge fundamental difference in the two approaches, right?
Yeah, I agree. And let's just for the listeners, let's talk about what HADEOS is. It stands for, it's a bad acronym, particularly these days with
sounds like hate.
The way things are. I know. It sounds, I don't know. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but it's a good idea. And it's a hypertext as the engine of application state. And what that means is that when you've got a browser, the state of the application is entirely encoded in the DOM. So the HTML or the DOM objects represented by that HTML in any event are the state. And then if you want to make a state change, you click on a link or you submit a form that goes to the server, some state change occurs, and then it streams back new HTML for the new state of the system. And that's hypertext as the engine of application state. And that's great. And it was very simple. And it was the original model of the web was very powerful because of that. But it had this usability issue where, you had to make full page refreshes, which were kind of clunky. And so HTMX is very much trying to return to that model, but also allow you to do more interesting UX interactions with the server that don't just, refresh the whole page. And it really is a return to that original model of the web, and taking HTML, which kind of stalled as a hypermedia, and driving it forward to say, okay, let's just see how far we can go with hypermedia.
And that's exactly why I feel it's a revolution, because it's healing, it's bringing back what it should be. Because from the software engineering and software architecture point of view, there's a huge advantage of relying on in-band information rather than expecting your clients to go elsewhere and read some manual and memorize a lot of things and get familiarized with the internal structure of your resources in order to be able to accomplish anything. That's a huge burden.
Right.
Like, for example, I had to renew my passport. All I needed to know is the endpoint, which is the address of the government agency where I should go. I didn't have to know anything else. Once I entered the building, they gave me a brochure.
Yeah.
This is in-band information. And say you need
Yeah.
2 photos. You need to fill out this form. So the dialogue goes back and forth. This is HADEOS in real life.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
getting the payload from, and I'm supplying some request, coming back with the response, back and forth, back and forth. End of the discussion, I got my passport renewed. I
Yep.
didn't have to know, and I didn't have to go and read some book or talk to other people. All you need is direct.
Or just know the address, right? That's the way a lot of
One
stuff
entry
is.
point, like in that restaurant, you enter, and now the conversation starts. You don't need to have any prior knowledge about anything.
Yeah.
All the
Yeah,
knowledge,
and that's
all the knowledge required to complete this transaction is in band, is in that particular moment, right? And that's
right.
right? And there's a huge advantage of that architecture because it's phenomenally decoupled. It's anti-fragile, right?
Yep.
Because it doesn't break. You don't have to worry about maintaining versions of your API or anything.
Yeah.
To me, that's powerful.
Yeah, it is. It's very powerful. And Roy Fielding's dissertation on the web, where all this terminology came from, is outlines this. And I think it's it's a long dissertation, and there's a lot of stuff in it that isn't relevant, unfortunately, but it's worth slogging through. Unfortunately, even the Wikipedia entries on REST and I think on HADEOS don't use HTML, which is, unfortunately, just for historical reasons, it went off on this tangent, and a lot of people don't even know that stuff very well anymore. And I don't blame them entirely, because I think some of the blame has to be laid at the feet of how there was. Say what one will about that dissertation by Roy Fielding, but it's not an easy read. It was, and I've yet to find a good resource explaining what he meant in a simple way. Maybe I should, it's easy to complain. Maybe I should write that page and just.
Martin Fowler had a really good blog post about that to boil down. I don't know if you had a chance to read it.
I'll look that up, but I noticed he also did the article on the API, the four levels of
that's what I'm talking about. 4 levels of.
Yeah, but that was focused on APIs. He didn't really, from what I remember, he didn't tie it into, wait a second, this is the way the web works, and maybe it applies to the API world, but he didn't say that. So that's an example of, in my mind. I just feel like there was this move to APIs, and everyone went there, and none of those thought leaders that I've seen, and I don't know everything that everyone said, but I just didn't see that person out there saying, hey, wait a second, we're talking about the web here. We're not talking about APIs. We're not talking about these things. We're talking about the web. And so I would have, it would have been, I think a lot of pain could have been avoided had
because
that.
Requiring the knowledge of the API is actually, you're asking clients to get familiar with the internal structure of the resource.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's just like, that's so brittle. The tight coupling, and something changes, everything breaks.
Yep. Absolutely.
Not a good idea.
Not a good model, and we've seen that. GraphQL. I keep.
And that's why they had to come up with versions, API/v1, v2, etc. That's really brittle and really crappy.
Yeah. I always look at those and I'm like, how did you get your first API so wrong? Like if we're on API v33, what happened for the first 30?
But again, going back to the restaurant experience, show me the menu.
Right.
Because whether it's a human client or a program client, it must come with some preferences. The client chooses. I choose from the menu what I want. But I got to see the menu. I cannot just walk in and say, "Oh, I feel like eating pancakes." Oh, sorry, this is a Japanese restaurant.
Right.
You have to see the menu, and this HTML document is your menu, where you can have one or more links, and you choose which one to activate, right? Whether programmatically or as a human being clicking on it.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a blog post. That brings up an interesting topic. I wrote a blog post on the Intercooler website called "HADEOS is for Humans." Yeah. And my assertion is that you need to consume a hypermedia effectively. you need agency. Like you need to be a human who can decide if you want to click on this or that or whatever, do whatever you want to do.
You have
right? And you have preferences, and you can, presented with new and novel UI, you can make a decision. I want to do that or I don't want to do that. And that's something that machines, as of yet, as far as I'm aware, not being at Google or in the Department of Defense, they're not great at making decisions like that yet. But humans are. And so this,
if I'm going to model a client and I'm going to simulate it, which is basically a computer program, there are preferences there in the code. Sure. We call them business policy rules, right?
Right.
And that program makes a decision.
Yeah.
And I think we should model it from the standpoint of a human user.
Sure.
And I think it's doable. I don't think you need AI or some fancy. It's simple logic, processing logic.
Right. Right.
No.
Yeah. I'm not as tuned in on that stuff as I used to be. But I come at it from a humane standpoint, I guess. Right. Hypermedias first and foremost were designed for humans, and that's what made them so awesome. You think back before the web, if you wanted to know something, you had to know the Gopher system to go to, if you even could figure out how to use Gopher, and then maybe you could, even Gopher was kind of a hypermedia. And before that, it was just, you went to the library, it was work. It was not very humane. It was good in some ways. There's aspects of it that I can romanticize pretty easily. But at the same time, one of the things that bothers me a little bit about how much REST and HADEOS has been hijacked. Well, people don't even talk about it anymore, but it was hijacked for a very long time by the API community. And to me, this is for humans. We're trying to build a networking system that survives catastrophic network issues, is resilient, and then allows humans to figure stuff out. And so I think a lot of that informs the style and architecture of HTMX, and sort of what I'm trying to encourage people.
It's not just about surviving the stress. The web is phenomenal, and we kind of abandoned that, but we should go back. It's anti-fragile, meaning upon experiencing stress, not only does it survive, it becomes stronger. On account of that stress. It becomes more resilient. And each stress is making it more and more resilient. This is the power of the web, right? We're not harnessing that.
No.
And I think the only way to do it is with this architecture where we are only dependent on the in-band information, not out-of-band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Out-of-band information is making it brittle.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. So I don't know. I'm optimistic though. I created Intercooler JS a decade.
Your work, what you did, I think, has can open doors, can bust the gate, and that's why the floodgates. We just need good tutorials, just for because I was hoping I can on my own have using HTMX prepare, because I would like to go back to my teams. I'm leading teams of engineers and show them. Tata, show the light. Look at this. You don't have to worry about React and Redux and all these things that are really keeping them.
I know.
Let's go back to simplicity. You can accomplish all of that by just simple. And big complex systems can only be built from something simple that works.
Yep.
To start with something like you did. You had your table. You wanted to, your first foray into this.
Yep.
A simple solution. Okay, give me a table from the server side, and then the ball starts rolling, right? And the snowball.
Yep.
So we need to somehow figure out how to have a real comprehensive, whether YouTube tutorial or something, and start spreading the news, because I think it's significant.
Well, and I agree. And I think I'm going to release 1.4 tomorrow of HTMX. And I think the next big push is going to be docs, and just trying to find out, I'd love to chat offline about what the best way to reach the C# community is, because I've had a lot of success with Django. And I think C# and Java. When I think about what other big, you just look at the top 10 languages. C# and Java. The reason why Django took off, I think, is that Python has traditionally been very underserved. It's a very popular language. A lot of people learn it in college here, and it has a lot of good tools available for it. But it's been underserved by the front end community because the front end community became so focused on JavaScript. And so they were just sitting there waiting for something like HTMX to come along where, I tell them, hey, you can stay in Django. It's all good. Just produce HTML. Here's a better way to build and a simple way to build web apps that dovetails with your existing infrastructure. And so the Java community feels a little bit more spread out, and Spring has a lot of mind share there, and they've kind of got their own way of doing things. But my hope is I can find the people, the thought leaders in the Java community and then in the C# community to get on the right podcasts and produce the right documentation that makes it sort of obvious. Okay, here's how you do that. One thing that might be a good exercise if you're willing to do it is to do MVC in HTMX with a C# backend, because that has a fair amount of interactivity associated with it. There's some pretty good examples out there already, and that might be a good piece of infrastructure that we could use to drive a good tutorial for C#.
Yeah.
So
my biggest excitement is that we're going back to HTML, which means we're going back to HADEOS.
Right. Yeah, it's nice to talk to someone who knows what that means. There's a lot of the younger kids don't know what that means.
I don't want to sound pompous, but that to me is the holy grail of system architecture. Therefore, I think we should go back to that philosophy, because it's going to be tough because most engineers are very hard core remote procedure call or just thinking about if I'm working with a system, in order for me to get some value out of interacting, I need to know it inside and out. Philosophy, what we're talking about is the exact flip side, which I don't need to know anything. Just give me the entry point and we'll figure it out. That's not,
let it go.
If you talk like that, people think you're losing your mind. Like, are you? Did you get a stroke? What's going on with you? Like, can't you? It's so counterintuitive to people who spend years, decades working with beefy systems, and you have the beefy editors and all these IntelliSense, you mention an object and you see what the object can do, and you're really prying into the innards of the system, which is a huge overhead, enormous overhead, right? And that's why we have all these armies of engineers poking around and building things, and it's getting more and more bloated. And here we are with another completely opposite approach, which is so hard to sell because people are like, no, you can't engineer like that. Right? It's a humane.
It is. It's humane. And I do want to if you go to the htmx.org and you go to the examples page, I think one of the best examples, there's the lazy load example, which is really good too, but there's also an active search example, which I think it's about the. And that's an example of when you go to Google and you start typing in a query, it shows you your results kind of as you type. And the example in HTMX of that ends up being about 3 or 4 attributes to implement something that's very similar. It's a little different, but it's similar functionally. And you could put that with 3 or 4 HTML attributes, not too much, in most web applications. And a lot of web apps would benefit tremendously from having that ability to do that.
Absolutely.
And so that's, when you say things like, oh, we should just go back to using HTML, they think of these big clunky web 1.0 apps that admittedly had issues associated with them at times from a usability standpoint. But what we're really trying to accomplish here is being able to have that nicer user experience with a more powerful hypermedia, but then stay within that original model. And I've been very surprised at how far people have been able to push user experience within the hypermedia network architecture, just as long as they're willing to maybe forego exactly the way that they did it with this more thick client style of development. It's different. It's a hypermedia. So you have to think a little differently. And I think you're right that it's not necessarily natural thinking for most engineers, but if you just step back and let go of some stuff, for example, a lot of people are really in love with modals, right? Like there's a lot of modals on the web these days. And modals, they're not really webby. They're not stateless. That's client-side state that like lives and, can be kind of tricky to deal with. Well, okay, what about doing inline editing rather than a modal? What if instead of clicking on a button, instead of getting a modal that pops up, what if you replace that element with an editable content, and then when you click save, it goes back to what it was? Well, from a user experience standpoint, that's fairly similar. You don't have drop shadows and so forth, and people are used to modals at this point because Bootstrap made them so popular back in the day. But if you're willing to let go of that, there's a hypermedia approach that plays better with the web, in my opinion.
I remember even
you could.
But listen, Carson, I remember even in the in the old days,
Yeah,
that's strictly desktop. Modal was discouraged, saying this is a bad user experience, even back then.
I know.
So
yep.
We should avoid it at all costs in any arrangement. It shouldn't be. It really is a bad approach.
Yeah.
Maybe it's simpler to program, but hey.
Yeah, I mean, it's just people are used to it, so we've got some habits to break. And but I think that makes it harder on people like us who are trying to sell hypermedia to the broader development community.
Yeah, I can tell you an anecdote that convinced me again of the power of hypermedia. Back in 2016, I remember, late 2015, I got really alarmed. I was working on a project company in Brooklyn, and I got alarmed with the snowballing and bloating of the front end. And I really felt something is wrong, even back then, right, with React and all that. And so all of a sudden, I made a 180 degrees turn, and I focused all my attention to conversational user interface, because I thought that's going to be the way out of the heavy-duty GUI.
Right.
And I spent a lot of focus and effort on conversational, which is basically chatbots, right?
Yeah.
I thought you can converse directly, and you can bypass all this rigmarole and whatnot. Then I realized that it's devilishly hard to design a deterministic or predictable interaction with the user.
Right.
And what was missing was the power of hypermedia and the power of URL, where by the virtue of you being shoehorned into a certain URL, your logic is implicit. With an empty text input box, you're not limiting to anything. You have no idea what the user is going to type, or if it's a voice, what the user is going to say. And then I totally gave up, because I realized, no, I cannot engineer this. We're going back to hypermedia. So I think it's strong. It's going to show its worth in the future, and that's why I'm excited about HTMX. I think it has phenomenal potential.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, no doubt. So the challenge now, as you say, is how do we make it mainstream?
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if I wanted to go mainstream, because the more GitHub issues I see, I'm like, oh man.
Well, no, mainstream more like a mindset, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there are, we should mention there are other things out there like I think HTMX is unique in that it's really focused on increasing the expressiveness of HTML. Like that soundbite is HTMX in a nutshell, and it's different than most other approaches. But you do have things like turbo links from the Rails community, and Hotwire now from the Rails community as well, where they're at least HTML oriented. They're not coming at it from the let's increase the expressivity of HTML standpoint, but you still do most of your server work in HTML, and so your server rendering is in HTML. And there's also Unpoly, which is similar as well. I really like that guy, the guy that does Unpoly. So there are a few different approaches. Obviously, I'm biased.
Yeah.
I like the HTMX approach. I really, when I went from intercooler to HTMX, I really tried to be disciplined about saying, okay, we're taking out all the like cool and interesting stuff, and really not all the cool and interesting stuff, but we're taking out all the stuff that doesn't follow this improving HTML as a hypertext sort of core idea. Just all that other stuff is gone. And I put in an extensions mechanism so that all the, kind of interesting stuff that you might want to do, but isn't really part of that core concept, could be done as an extension instead. And so I've been really happy with how that's turned out. I think it has a lot of coherence as a library because of that.
And also, I just want to mention, we're kind of running out of time, but back in 2006, I have published a blog post which I called resource-oriented architecture. It was just a brain fart, but it's something to take off, because I think back then it was this kind of early days of SOA and SOAP and all these things, and I felt like
good old SOAP.
Yeah. Anyway, I had this kind of brain fart that I'm thinking, well, the web is actually a collection of resources.
Yep.
Right?
Sure is.
And we interact with those resources via hypermedia.
Yep.
You send a request. Yeah, you send a request, and then what you get back is the resource representation. You don't get the resource; you get the representation. However, that resource chooses to present itself to you, right? And even if you say, "I want to delete this resource," and it says, "Okay, cool, it's deleted," you don't know if it's deleted or not, right? It just tells you that. So that's the beauty of the app, shielding you from the innards, from the ugly details, the inner organs. But then there was so for a while it was taking off, and there was some guy, even a few guys wrote the book about resource, and then my blog post as a first thing, blah blah. And I thought, oh, this is going to take off. But then service-oriented guys came down like a hailstorm, right, and said, no, it's all about services. To me, services is more like RPC, right?
Yep.
You're making calls it's because what I like about the web is only 4 verbs.
Yep.
So simplicity versus trillions of verbs that you can invent. Select, get, update customer where the customer balance is, blah, blah, blah. So you can construct these endless verbs.
Yep.
And now your life becomes a nightmare, because now you have to
and I think it's a way of doing things. You can build RPC systems. That's fine. And there are use cases where it makes more sense to do it that way. But the web isn't that. And the more you try and make the web that, the more you're going to have the problems and the benefits that come along with it. And I think trying to decouple this idea of having a good UI requires RPC. Just getting that out, you don't have to, if you want to have a pretty good UI, you don't have to use RPC to do it. You can use the original model for the web. And I too have been beset upon on all sides by single page application type engineers who will come in and say mean things on the internet about me. And that's fine. I get where they're coming from. And certainly, I think it requires a certain level of maturity and maybe just understanding the historical context of the web. And then it probably falls to us who have this, not to toot our own horns, but deeper understanding of the original web model, to communicate it to the broader and younger community who didn't grow up with it the way we did. I think one of the benefits of having some gray in my beard is that I've seen a lot of this stuff, right? And so we both worked on RPC-based systems, like real ones, not web-based ones. And we went through, we know what SOAP is and all the rest of it.
We know about RMI, we know about Corba, all
Corba.
Failed, all these failed grandiose schemes of how to, But I think it helps.
So,
go ahead.
No, so I was just going to say, I think that's something that we need to do a good job of. And I try to, it's hard because you always want to start off with something practical so that people get hooked. But there is this deeper this deeper aspect to this whole thing of like, we're really trying to make the web the web.
Yeah.
Let's use the web as the web, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think it may help to shift the way of thinking from services to resources. Again, I'm putting my own horn. But when you think about resources, for example, there's a house for sale. It's a resource, right? It's posted on the web. Is it a service? No, it's a resource. You want to interact with it. If you want to learn about how much is it, where is it, so you can engage in a dialogue, whether programmatically or as a human operator. But it's a resource that can tell you a few things about itself, and it can do a few things that if you obtain clearance, can do a few things for you if you ask it politely, right?
Right.
And so that way of thinking all of a sudden changes from this RPC and to more like a different level of abstraction, where this is how I interact. This is how I get things done, because at the end of the day, we just want to get things done. That's why we use it. How do I get things done? I can send some requests, and you can respond, send me the response, and I can realize, oh, you can do that as well. Okay, well, how about you try this, right? That is a more civilized way of, instead of this hard, like, do this, do that. I send you the request. I call your procedure and you do it. This is very primitive in my mind. Immature. But for some reason,
it's different, Like I said, I don't think there are places where I use RPC, but the web isn't it.
No, exactly.
At least not in most situations. And so,
I'm so happy we kind of seem to see look at the web the same way, which is very nice and encouraging. I want to thank you for your time, Carson. This has been a conversation, and let's continue when you have some more time. I'd like to learn more, and let's collaborate maybe on how do we, like you said, widen this. Maybe go to C#.NET community. Something to do with Ruby and Node, whatever. I don't know.
The Node guys might be, that's like the final boss.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, if you want to use JavaScript, it's fine. Just do it on the server side.
Yeah.
Let's leave the browser out of it. But it's fine. It's all good.
Well, so happy to finally see you face to face, and let's continue our collaboration. I'm a big fan.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on. And I like the more philosophical stuff, so I usually try and stay off of that. So it was a lot of fun.
We always learn. Spend an hour. Thank you, Carson.
Cool.
Stop recording, and we'll chat soon.
All right, sounds good.